Hi, welcome to Chapter 2, How Do Monsters Reflect Their Times? You think about it, monsters are constantly changing. There are a few particular types that seem to show up again and again, maybe across the world. The vampires, obviously, is one. Mermaids would be another one. Some monsters, though, are very particular to a time and place, maybe even in our own time and place. We've already kind of been introduced to certain ones already. The idea is that if we begin with the idea that monsters reflect some sort of fear that we have, they kind of embody that fear, that anxiety, perhaps, or maybe they're real and this is just all for fun. The idea is that we need to look at what those fears are. I mean, chapter 1, we had Godzilla. That's a pretty straightforward monster that comes out of the atomic bomb, which was dropped on, of course, Hiroshima and Nagasaki at the end of World War II. And 9 years later, Japanese filmmakers put on this movie called Godzilla, which is a pretty good manifestation of those fears. So what are our fears? Our real fears: terrorism, disease, hello COVID, other kinds of fears of things, people, circumstances. As we progress in our society, we seem to, in some ways, be more and more powerful and knowledgeable, at the same time weaker, more at the mercy of things beyond our control, things that we do not understand. Chapter 2 begins with Ted Genoways, Here Be Monsters, written shortly after the attacks of 9/11. I know that for some students, 9/11 is now already something in history books, something they didn't experience firsthand. That's the passage of time. But there is no question that we still live in what we might call a post 9/11 world, in which our politics, our military endeavors are tied to this war on terrorism that began with our response to 9/11. And while Osama bin Laden is dead, and has been now for a few years, there are many terrorists in the world. But how do we think of them? And to what have they given rise in our imaginations? How have we maybe expressed those fears, right? And do those fears take us into a world in which we start to attack ourselves, to restrict ourselves? After all, what is the safest place? Is inside, a cage. Right? Have we built ourselves a cage? Daniel Cohen, in The Birth of Monsters, takes us back through some history, looking at different monsters that we have found amongst ourselves or in other places. Some of these are classic monsters, old monsters, medieval monsters. The griffin comes to mind, right, as a monster that comes from the Middle Ages, a combination monster, eagle and lion, sometimes with a snake tail. If you're a Harry Potter fan, by the way, it's not an accident that Harry belongs to the House of Gryffindor. Not an accident at all. And that the Slytherins are the snakes. Hello. That's pretty modern, pretty contemporary, even for old symbolism. Right? Monsters are often connected to the foreign, to the distant, right? Cohen at least sends us into other parts of the world beyond North America or Western Europe to investigate some other monsters and their places and times. So that raises some interesting issues, some ideas maybe for writing about. There is a short passage from the Old English poem Beowulf that follows. Beowulf is at least 1,000 years old. It may be as much as 1400 years old. The Beowulf story is a classic hero story. Beowulf is the name of the main character, a Scandinavian, Giat, who is super strong, super amazing, right? He is the Superman, if you will, of his time. He doesn't fly or anything like that. He's just a really great fighter. Really great fighter. In the Beowulf story, there are three major monsters. The passage that we see deals with one, the first one, Grendel. And Grendel has come and basically savaged the kingdom of King Hrothgar. Right? And Grendel is very particular. He doesn't go wandering around killing people all over the place. Just one specific place. The Mead Hall. You know, the bar. The Mead Hall is more than a bar. It is the site where Hrothgar is trying to establish civilization. Trying to establish rule. To stop this non-stop bloodshed and war that this culture has experienced and begin to build something good. Grendel comes into the mead hall at night and kills all the knights who are in there. Again and again and again. To the point that people stop sleeping in the mead hall. Right? Pretty wise idea right there. But Grendel's an interesting character because he is seen as a descendant of Cain. If you're not familiar with Cain from the Abel and Cain story in the Old Testament, not a very good guy. He killed his own brother. Right? And so he is associated with demons and monsters. He is, I should say that Grendel is a monster, descended from this evil path. Right? So there's a lot of interesting stuff there. And the world of Beowulf 1,000, 1,400 years ago was not like our world today. It was a rough world. Violent. Lots of death. Right? Nature that we see nowadays as precious and, in fact, under attack. That nature is, being victimized by human civilization. In those days, nature was dangerous. Nature was the enemy. That's the whole point of trying to establish civilization, is so people can survive without the vagaries of nature. So there's a lot going around in the Beowulf story. After Beowulf comes a Native American tale, translated by a guy named Gerald Vizenor. It's also a hero tale, like Beowulf is a hero tale. This is a hero tale. Nanna-Bozo and the Gambler. Nanna-Bozo is a young hero, a young man who does heroic deeds. And like Beowulf, he does them to save his own people. There are differences, and it's a very interesting read. And there's some interesting stuff about his father and his mother who is dead. And then eventually, though, he goes to take on the great gambler, who is, quite frankly, associated with death. You gamble and you lose, you sacrifice your life. And for some reason, the gambler never loses. This is the person that Nanna-Bozo has to kill. Well, not person, because it's a monster. Very interesting tale. You might want to look at that. Cursed by a Bite by Matt Kaplan is probably the most scientifically grounded work in our textbook in Monsters. And what Kaplan does in this passage is part of a larger book. But what Kaplan does is he basically makes an argument that belief in monsters actually was reasonable. That there are real scientific historical connections to why we might believe in certain monsters. And in particular, the passage that we have deals with two of our favorites in our own time, vampires and zombies. I know you're going to say, oh, come on, there's no scientific evidence of vampires living. Well, no, of course not. But you go back in history and you look at what the people there saw and how they understood what they saw. It makes the idea of the vampire much more reasonable, if I may say. Now, this is the old school vampire, not the Dracula vampire, but the vampire that predates Polidori. Just the blood-sucking monster. No romance here, okay? No, attractive, seductive character. This is just a straightforward monstrous vampire. And also the zombie, who, of course, is very popular in our own time. And again, Kaplan finds scientific evidence for the belief that zombies are real. The next piece is by Poole, Monstrous Beginnings, W. Scott Poole. Again, this talks about how monsters come into being, how reasonable or thoughtful people were or weren't. This passage, though, particularly focuses on the witches, something we haven't talked about much. But I'm pretty sure almost everybody ought to be familiar with the Salem witch trials from the early 17th century. And again, there's this discussion, excuse me, not early, but late 17th century. My bad. Yeah, I know. Kind of scary, right? But the idea of the witch trials, that people really thought these women were witches and could do these magical things, is again not just simply a product of some kind of mass hysteria where everybody loses their mind, but actually it's connected to religion, connected with the experiences of being a Puritan in North America. It's connected to their prejudices, right? Their preformed ideas about people, not only by race, origin, gender, and religion, right? So all these things working together lead to what we now look at as a really horrifying thing, the persecution of people as witches. We still use the term witch hunt, right? You see that. It's a negative, not a positive. If we want to move into our own times, AI, artificial intelligence. Yeah, this is a monster that's relatively new. Relatively, meaning traces back to the mid-20th century. Okay, within the last 100 years, well within the last 100 years. Right? The idea that we create an intelligence that is so smart, it takes over. Does this sound vaguely familiar? Matrix, Terminator, iRobot. Right? Our pop culture has embraced this. Nick Bostrom, writing Get Ready for the Dawn of Superintelligence, is basically warning us. This is not just entertainment, folks. This could be real. I've always thought this is very interesting, this quest for artificial intelligence. We already have it in some rudimentary forms, but where it could go could be scary. And finally, we finish with Robbie by Isaac Asimov. Basically a short story about a robot and a little girl who considers the robot her best friend. And her parents try to show her that the robot is just simply a machine, not really a friend. Things don't go quite how they think they will. Good luck in Chapter 2.